The goal of institutional economics is to understand how the social context and the rules that govern behavior in society affect the transaction cost economics and the outcomes that we see in the real world.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value, a place for thinkers and builders, where we ask questions about freedom, Bitcoin, and creativity. My guest today is Dr. Murray Rudd, an environmental economics and policy researcher who has written extensively on the impact of proof of work and Bitcoin, including writing academic papers with Satoshi Action Education. Murray, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Cody. Thanks for having me back on. It's great to be here.
Oh, well, you've been working, last time we spoke, you've been working on Satoshi Action Education papers and research, and you've been doing this for a while now. Have you got much to report on? Like, what sort of cut through have you been getting with this research, Murray?
I'm just trying to think. The last time we talked, I don't think we'd published the methane mining paper at that time, if I recall. So we got that one out into a journal. We've had a couple of other things that have gone out as working papers. Right now, I've had a couple of journal rejections too. I have a project that looks at the 2024 Bitcoin social media and parses that, takes it into pieces, and identified really what the big issues that were being spoken about across pretty well all Bitcoin podcasts. And I tried to get that summarized, and I've got it desk rejected a couple of times now, which means that when you submit a journal article to a journal, first of all, it goes to an editorial gatekeeper, and it has to get past that gatekeeper, that editor, before it's even sent out to review. And sometimes what you'll get, if people don't like Bitcoin, or if they, in my case, if they don't like AI that was also used as part of the analysis, they might reject it. So that's where we are with that. So as an alternative, I'm working on actually a full-length book project on that right now.
Yeah, I'm keen to dive into the book piece in a moment, but just coming back to the editors in these journals, I wanted to talk a little bit about that because it seems to be an issue, and I've been trying to understand where this stems from. So, I mean, is it a political thing? Do you think this is coming down to individuals who maybe just have a bias against Bitcoin, or?
Yeah, sometimes. So so there's a couple of different types of editors. Diving into the details, there's an editor-in-chief who usually makes that initial decision about whether it goes out to what's called a handling editor or an associate editor. And then the associate editor will actually recruit the reviewers. So there's a 3-step process in there for most journals. And in the case of the Bitcoin papers, the editors-in-chief are in the business of trying to maximize visibility and citations for their journals. And there's obviously a few people that just don't like Bitcoin, and they see a Bitcoin paper and they don't understand it, and they just toss it out right away and reject it. There's other journals where you might get an editorial desk rejection that's actually quite legitimate. Like sometimes if I send something out to a journal, I don't know the energy journals that well. It's not historically, it's not my main field. So I don't know the editors and what their particular perspectives are. So it's a little bit hit and miss sometimes going out to them. And sometimes the journals, they just, a Bitcoin paper might not fit in with what they are really trying to do. So there's a number of different factors, but certainly I had one desk rejection from one of the academics that's a top Bitcoin publisher. He publishes in the finance realm. For some reason, he's an associate editor on an environmental journal, and he actually rejected the methane paper I mentioned before, gave it a desk rejection, which there was no need for at all. And yeah. I'm pretty sure that was just sort of his view on Bitcoin was very quite skeptical, and I think that's just what it was in that particular case.
And what was your high level takeaways on the methane piece? Like, did you have some good conclusions come out of that, or?
I mean, my view is that the methane mining was pretty economically marginal, and what I mean by that is that it looks to me that it would typically take US 4.5 cent per kilowatt hour electricity. That would be the cost that they could generate electricity, say at a smaller US landfill. And 4.5 cents is going to be economical, but there's also some risk associated with that when hash price is low. And so when I looked at my perspective on the methane mining from landfills, at least in the US context, is that you can't look at it. You're never going to get industrial scale miners that are going in and mining it profitably. But it's great for smaller scale miners and for any landfills that are just looking to replenish or recoup some of their operational costs and reduce the local tax burden. I think it's absolutely awesome. And I don't understand really why a lot more landfills haven't taken it up so far.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the hash price is a major major issue right now for a lot of miners, and I guess this idea. I mean, there's something I want to posit to you, but coming back to Satoshi Action Education, on the website, it does say, you're doing this, Satoshi Action Education is doing this work, academic and scholarly, to provide credible evidence-backed research so the public understands the truth about the positive impacts of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining for our economy, environment, etc. And I just wondered, for me, that felt like a bit of a loaded mission in the sense that it talks about the truth about the positive impacts. And I wonder, I mean, I'm happy to talk about this openly in terms of what does that mean? Because there may be situations where it doesn't actually make sense economically, or it doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons. And is it able to be looked at with unbiased lens in that case?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for myself coming in, that's always a condition that if I go through and do some modeling or do a review, that I'll make sure that it's as neutral as possible in scope. That's probably just the positioning on Satoshi Action. We're debating. There's some debate going on right now whether we should maybe merge the two organizations, not technically merge them, but sort of from a outward facing perspective, have things a little bit more integrated. So, I think that's probably just early wording that was put up on the Satoshi Action webpage a couple of years ago that really doesn't reflect sort of the actual practicality of going through and doing academic research. We're interested in cases and documenting cases and doing modeling where there is potential, where we see potential for example, for methane mining really to contribute positively. But like in this case, in the landfill case, where we weren't raving that this is going to be profitable and it was just going to be a great business all the time. Some of the people in industry have said that they can, the landfills can generate electricity at 2 cents US per kilowatt hour, in which case virtually everything's going to be profitable. In the landfill case, we also covered a little bit that when a landfill, say a larger landfill where you're producing landfill gas at scale, and you are able to go in and put in bigger generators, and maybe you have local customers for the electricity, the grid or local industrial customers, then it becomes much more economically marginal for Bitcoin mining to go in. But at the same time, Bitcoin mining, even in those situations, can offer the same sort of, response programs and sop up that extra energy when the market demand from the other sources is quite soft. So I think there's always a role. And the nodal guys that we co-authored with in the landfill paper, they do this down at their Utah site. They're directly switched in or hooked into the grid, so they can transmit electrons to the Utah grid when the price is right, or they can use it for Bitcoin mining when the market price isn't all that great. So there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of individual situations. We had just a couple of weeks ago, we had an interesting talk with people up in Alaska and the landfill operators up there, and sort of getting a feel for what goes on in some of these more remote landfills and what their issues were. And I don't know if anything will eventually come out of it, but there was some interest up there in just learning about Bitcoin mining. So obviously, part of what we do is really try to educate users.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's sort of, again, maybe this copy comes from an early version of the website, but I mean, I think it's kind of true in a sense that the organization is here, in a sense, to push Bitcoin forward and Bitcoin mining and the benefits. And then it just so happens that there maybe needs to be a neutral approach with the academic research that comes out. But I guess from this lens of doing research and doing engagement with journals, it seems like there might be other cases where an organization is funding research and they may have a mission in mind, but the research, of course, needs to be neutral. And I just wonder, we're in this kind of interesting place where it's one part think tank, kind of visionary sci-fi, like what is possible with Bitcoin mining. One part of it's also commercial, where it's like, well, what are the economics of it? I mean, how do you see all those pieces working together? And then also that bigger vision of what, pushing Bitcoin forward, and then also kind of the neutral aspect of research.
Yeah, well, I think for us, starting with the bigger vision, like what I would love to see is to get methane mitigation through Bitcoin mining up onto the radar screen for some of the international organizations. So methane in general right now, the international problem with it and relating to climate change is that methane's so potent, it's fixing or reducing methane emissions is the number one easiest way to reduce overall carbon dioxide equivalent emissions globally, because you're reducing the output of gas that's like up to 87 times more potent than carbon dioxide alone. And I think that we've seen a little bit of this internationally. Some of the international organizations have cited the Crusoe research and the Crusoe mining example. So there's a little bit of awareness, but in general, you go to the big, like anybody that goes to the big methane conferences and or that deals in the UN or some of the international initiatives to control methane emissions, Bitcoin mining isn't on the radar screen at all. So part of what we want to do is to do case studies like we did with the people from Nodal Energy, and just demonstrate that, yes, this is what the economics, what the models tell us. And the way I do modeling is there's a lot of uncertainty in the models that I incorporate. So it's almost like eventually we could be in a position where we could say put a modeling platform online, something that would just have sliders for all your different assumptions, everything from your miner, the rig type, through to your electricity costs locally, whether or not your landfill site also got carbon credits, or if there was competitive products. So I think that's quite possible. I've been thinking about that. We haven't got to that yet. I use a proprietary software called Analytica, which is really, really good, but I've been using it like for 25 years. And I know that I should go to Python and use AI and help me code up things in Python. So it could be an open source model that could go out. That eventually, if I can do that, that will probably bring some more attention and might help some of the people that have different situations that maybe are on the fringes of economic profitability, but if the business arrangements are right, if you're dealing with municipalities or cities that are taxing local citizens to operate a waste treatment plant or a landfill, and they can recover 20-30% of their costs at the same time, that's all good. That helps out all the way around. The other thing I think that has some potential that we haven't really got into yet, it's crossed my mind, is that there's a lot of these landfills, they're never going to be commercially profitable from a Bitcoin mining perspective. But if they were to cooperate and have some sort of like nonprofit or coordinated organization that could help educate individual landfills about Bitcoin mining, and also maybe provide, arrange for services like, say, computer comparers across different sites, that it might help landfills come on board that are only recovering part of their cost of production for the electricity.
Well, just on that note, so I was watching another video. It was talking about some of the ideology behind something like driverless cars, and there is no consumer demand for that product. It's being pushed sort of top down, and it sort of has tailings of ideology and kind of technology first, and kind of there's assumptions within this kind of push for this kind of technology. And I just wonder, coming back again to the structure of what you're doing here, like, there is a market aspect. It can be profitable and it can be good to do it in terms of raw economics, but it seems like there is an ideological piece that is really quite important here. And if it gets embraced by let's be real, the state regulators, as a solution that's within their or it's on their radar, as you say, that can maybe lead to a new pathway that is maybe hard to see from a purely commercial perspective, right? Because it is marginal, and it might be that, and we'll get to this in a moment, maybe when we talk about transaction cost economics, but maybe it's just easier to not think about it because it's too much hassle, and they'd rather just do what they're doing at the moment. And I just wonder if you have any commentary on that, kind of the beyond the economics, but actually the ideology, the bigger vision behind Bitcoin mining as a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't view it from an ideological perspective myself. I know some people do. I'm totally an economist. I view it from I don't want to get into jargon, but there's this thing called marginal abatement costs, and in an ideal world, we could look at the methane situation and we could say that we have 10 different technologies, and each of them has the potential to mitigate methane, and each of them has a certain cost associated with mitigating methane. And where I would like to get to with methane, Bitcoin methane mining is, well, what are the actual mitigation costs? And if we can ever figure that out, then that is something that naturally slots into the bigger picture. So for me, that's not an ideological thing at all. That's just like sensible climate policy in action. And it's bringing potentially a new technology to this very big challenge that we have globally. Now, do we want to go out and put Bitcoin miners on absolutely everything? Well, in some cases, it's not going to make any sense, but that depends a little bit on sort of what the social situation is and what the alternative uses for that energy are, and whether there or not there's industrial waste heat applications in the area. There's a lot of different things that go on. And for instance, like many of the wastewater treatment plants could conceivably they do produce methane, and that could be used for Bitcoin mining. But right now, most of those are urban, and it doesn't really make sense to go in and put Bitcoin miners into an urban area, really, per se. It's just, but again, for me, that's an economics question. That's not a ideological question.
Yeah.
Well, and we also have agriculture facilities that are sort of the same thing. Some are rural, they're quite remote, cost recovery is really important. Maybe in other food processing plants, they're quite industrial, they have other, their waste products can be valorized in different ways.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is, when I talk about the ideology, is, again, these desk rejections, the conversations I've had with people where, anything but Bitcoin mining, whether it's pumping water to the top of a hill or some crazy Rube Goldberg machine contraption to capture this wasted energy is better than Bitcoin for them because of the negative political, ideological connotations. And that's why I guess I wonder whether there isn't an ideological piece to this, where it's kind of normalizing even and kind of developing a conversation around Bitcoin that gives Bitcoin value. Because ultimately, in my experience, economics is important, but if people really hate it and they don't understand that it's actually important and valuable, they really struggle to even look at the numbers with clear eyes.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And but what you said is actually at the core of it, that they don't understand it. So a lot of it is just understanding. A lot of people are going by the Alex DeVries research, the Digiconomist, and there's just a whole slew of papers out there that have used some fairly flawed assumptions over time, and those have really stuck. So one of the other papers that I did, now this was a bit longer, we might have talked about this one before, but I did a shorter paper, an opinion piece called Bitcoin is Full of Surprises. And it sort of was a mix of pragmatist philosophy thinking and Bitcoin mining. And so and why, for the traditional left side of the political spectrum, there's a lot of potential benefits: financial inclusion, there's climate mitigation possibilities, things that are important to the left-leaning constituency. And yet there's been such negativity that it never has reached the even gotten into the conversation so far. So part of the reason that I wrote that article, that's not something that was really for public or general consumption. It was almost more of an education piece for academics. And so a lot of the writing that I do actually that's what my target audience is, actually academics. It's like, okay, actually consider this. So what does it take? You have to be surprised at something before you really investigate it. But if you blow it off, you're not investigating, so you have to, there's some effort that has to go into it, and you go down this bit of a rabbit hole until you come up with some sort of personal conclusion that provides you a level of confidence. And like how you do that for people that just, ignore things and don't really think things through, and especially in academia where that's supposed to be what you're doing, is always a bit of a strange thing to deal with. But it's very common in academia. I mean, academia, going back to your original question about editors a lot of times have a particular field, or a journal has a particular group that sponsors it. And so you have to be working with their methodology and sort of adhering to their philosophical basis to be able to publish in that journal. So it's not like academics is not some like neutral, let's find the truth space. It's like everybody in it has vested interests, and whether those vested interests are advancing individual careers or a particular epistemic community, like a group of researchers that share common ideas about methodology and epistemology, it's a little bit of a minefield. And then once, a lot of academic researchers, once you have success in one area, you try to continue that on. And Alex DeVries is a really good example of this. He had success before, well, he still doesn't have a PhD, but he had success in his original opinion pieces on Bitcoin, and those have just kept perpetrating on. And that's probably a result of the Cell Press, the journal that publishes most of his work, being able to garner a lot of citations off of his work. So it's good for them because the journals like citations. It's good for Alex DeVries because he gets more publications. He gets to all these opportunities to sort of spew out his side of the argument. And then he's able also to sort of parlay that Bitcoin experience, and now he's been working on AI more generally. And so sort of bringing some of the arguments that he developed in the Bitcoin space and taking them out and applying them in the AI space. So he is doing a PhD, or he was, the last I heard, he was part-time PhD in one of the Dutch universities. And so if he is aiming for an academic career, it's just ideal because, like, it doesn't matter whether your people that cite you hate you or love you, like, it's still citations, and that's what counts in academia.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? These incentives.
It is. It's a real snake pit sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my concluding remarks on that would be, I do think there is, as you say, I mean, there's a number of layers to it, and I think there's a sort of a real politic an approach that can be effective where you kind of have to play the game a little bit. And I think certainly putting research out there to counter some of this stuff, trying to get it into the mainstream, trying to get headlines as well. This is all very important because people don't read stuff anymore. They take the bait, they take the memes, and kind of countering that. It's a lot of effort, but I think it is ultimately a worthwhile endeavor to get the message out.
I'll add one more point on that quickly, if I could too. Some of the people that you interview and are friends with are involved in sort of countering some of this on a more informal basis. If for Satoshi Action, we did a piece on, there was a, what was it? There was a dreadful piece out of the European Central Bank. And so we had Freddie New and Alan Farrington, I think it was, that were co-authors on that. The reason that we went ahead with a counter paper or counter opinion on that paper was we knew it was still out in review, so we wanted to get something out potentially it affected reviewers. There was another paper just published last week, and it was based on Gabriel Dantzis data that he collected for his New York Times article. And so it was another, I wouldn't call it a hit piece, but some of their assumptions were quite flawed. And I saw that back in November as a working paper, and we didn't bother trying to comment on that because we knew it was already in review. It was at one of the Nature journals, and it was just kind of pointless to do that. So for me, we don't spend much time countering, providing counter arguments or blogs or things like that. I try to focus mainly on getting the actual academic papers out, even if they're perspective or opinion pieces. I think they're more valuable than strictly something that is either a comment to the journal that this particular paper is trashy or there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, understood. And there's also that classic political idea that if you're explaining, you're losing. And it's hard, man, because there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of distraction. And well, I do want to move on to talking about you mentioned in passing a book project. And I know we had been chatting over email, Murray, just around potentially Bitcoin-oriented institutional economics as a book topic. So maybe tell me a little bit more about where your thinking is with that, please.
Yeah, well, I've actually got two things I'm thinking of for the book. One is the research, the horizon scan thing. And then, I've sort of sketched out ideas for an institutional economics book, too. And, so many people in the Bitcoin space identify as Austrian economists, or they adhere to Austrian economics school, and I don't. I'm an institutional economist by training, so not so much on my master's degree, but my PhD was very institutional. I actually studied at Indiana University under a woman called Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for her work on common property and self-governance, and that was something that has been my whole career. I've been institutionally oriented. And there's some pretty key differences between institutional economics and Austrian economics. But at the same time, there's also some commonalities in terms of self-governance as an aspiration for society, and the role of individuals in society. So what I'm thinking about, and it's still very early, so I'm not organized at all on this yet. In fact, I'll tell you that I actually went back and reviewed a whole bunch of my notes that I'd made earlier using AI, and got myself some speaking points along the way, just so I tried to and read them this afternoon just to try to refresh where I was myself. After a while without working on a project, it sort of fades from the memory a little bit. So but generally it's what I want to do is articulate what an institutional economics approach means for Bitcoin, and what the different implications might be that flow from that versus, the standard Austrian perspective.
Yeah. So diving into that, you gave me some breadcrumbs to follow, and I dived into it myself, and I found transaction cost economics to be highly fascinating. I dived into Ronald Coase, who I think actually came up with the idea originally in the 1930s, which is really this idea of the transaction costs associated with doing business lead to the development of firms, because it's cheaper and more efficient to work within the company and divide labor and do everything within your company than to have it fully decentralized and just have this nebula of workers who are doing the work on a market rate, which I guess is that sort of where you see the difference with Austrian economics, that it sees the market ultimately as this perfect decentralized tool versus formations of these firms.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. I mean, Austrian economics generally, the view is that the individual makes decisions. Prices are signals that convey information about relative preferences, and I don't know if I'm qualified to really talk more about that, but Austrian economics does seem to, from an institutional economics perspective, make assumptions about property rights that don't really align with what we view as reality. And so there's some commonalities, and Austrian takes the bigger picture. Austrian economics is generally very qualitative, and they tend to use a lot of deductive logic. Institutional economists, at least modern institutional economists, the new institutional economists, are very quantitative, very empirical, and look at the issues of within companies. So do companies contract out for certain services, or do they carry them out internally? And Oliver Williamson, another institutional economist, won a Nobel Prize that he shared with Elinor Ostrom on that research of his. And so it was the economics of the firm that really got institutional economics and transaction cost economics in particular really into the mainstream, even though their origins go back to John Commons and Ronald Coase and well, not so much Oliver North, but those earlier 1930s to 1950s when the ideas developed, and Oliver Williamson really picked them up and extended them. So Williamson had all these conditions, or his idea. He has this thing called discriminating alignment hypothesis, and basically the idea is that you have certain problems are defined by certain features, and in business it might be stickiness of prices, for example. Some businesses, they work in a really competitive market, everything swings up and down very quickly. Other businesses, maybe there's some friction, whether it's supply chain or on the demand side, and so businesses face different challenges, and as a result, the business governance, whether they vertically integrate or horizontally like spread out, take the whole supply chain in or contract things out, those all are reflections of the type of problem that they face. So decentralization in a business isn't a decision. Like the business doesn't go out and say, like maybe we tend to do in the Bitcoin space, a business doesn't say, oh, we're going to decentralize as much as possible. For them, it's a business decision. It's an economic decision that and Williamson said that they naturally gravitate or evolve to the situation where they minimize their transaction costs. They set up their businesses to minimize transaction costs. And so that's really... That's a huge difference from Austrian economics. Austrian economics doesn't get into that at all, as far as I'm aware of.
Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, there's this question: why do firms exist at all if the market is perfectly efficient? And a question, well, the answer is, the market isn't perfectly efficient, and firms arise when internal coordination is cheaper than transacting through the market. And this is, I mean, you could see this quite easily. I mean, it's it's going to be cheaper to hire somebody as an employee than as a freelancer, generally speaking. And so a freelancer will have a higher rate because of uncertainty. There's different expectations maybe, but there's always these kind of trade-offs. And I found that really interesting because we do see in the world today there's quite a lot of centralization happening with large tech companies. The world is in the hands of a few people, and this sort of moment in time where in another episode I talked to somebody about how, in a sense, base layer reality is owned by a very small number of people in terms of raw materials and these kinds of things. And Bitcoin kind of, again, on an ideological level, is kind of going the other way, where it says, well, everyone, we should decentralize. It's an important thing to uphold as a value. Even if it's uneconomic, you should be running your own Lightning node. You should be doing everything yourself. But the market is also pushing towards people using custodians and using Lightning accounts. It's not actually a wallet, stuff like this. So, maybe looping that back to Bitcoin, how do you see transaction cost economics applying to, say, what we're seeing with the Bitcoin world?
Well, I think there's just so much potential for it to be applied. You look into the mining industry, for example, and these questions about geographic placement. So how does a company decide where to locate? And that's energy cost to some extent, but there's also transaction costs. I guess it should also specify transaction costs for your listeners. Transaction costs are the things that aren't like really part of the cost of doing business. It can be things like strategic behavior and litigation and negotiation. There's all these things that fall in the context of it's the environment that your business actually operates in, and so there's different ways that those larger scale costs can be minimized along the way. So from a transaction cost perspective, think of Bitcoin mining and the integration with AI and high performance computing, what's going on, the different options for custodying rigs versus owning all your own rigs. That's a classic transaction cost economics problem right there. So there's a lot going on there. You can look also to the whole custody and ETF sphere. There's different transaction cost economics arguments there. One of the things that I think is also interesting and important to differentiate is that Bitcoin is a decentralized technology, a fully decentralized technology that can be re-centralized in some ways. But just because Bitcoin is inherently decentralized doesn't necessarily mean that the businesses and firms that use Bitcoin follow the same logic. And so there's this multi-level institutional or transaction cost thing going on. So it's going to vary, like, according, what's the problem that the firm is trying to deal with? Well, if you're trying to ensure institutional adoption, you have to have all these other rules and regulations and assurances in place that you don't have as an individual when you're just basically have your Bitcoin in cold storage. So there's interesting variations within that. And so part of the thing that I'm thinking for this book is that within institutional economics, and this goes to Lynn Ostrom's work, you can classify rules. So we have rules about like who can participate in a particular activity and when and how and where and what are the outputs and what sort of outcomes or impacts might those have. And so we have all these different levers from a policy perspective that we can take to sort of change the rules of the game. We can also invest in different areas and different types of capital assets that we have. And so how Bitcoin fits into this, what I would see is that like each segment of the Bitcoin space and the marketplace and the systems that make Bitcoin function in the world, these are all different institutionally. And so we have these nested like systems within systems within systems, but each one of them in theory can be described quite precisely by the different rules. And at the base layer, Bitcoin's rules are very transparent for the most part. We have some social norms that come in, as we've seen with the op return controversy over the last little while. But for the most part, Bitcoin's rules were set by Satoshi, or they're set by developers since then. And those should be fairly easy to describe from an institutional perspective, from a rules and social norms perspective. When we get out to the Coinbases of the world, then that's like a whole different thing. I mean, there are rules there, but they're multi-tiered, and there's political engagement, and there's lobbying, and there's resource allocations that flow through like quite obscure channels sometimes. And understanding this, that's the goal. The goal of institutional economics is to understand how the social context and the rules that govern behavior in society affect the transaction cost economics and the outcomes that we see in the real world. So that's why it's empirical. And in some cases, we're going to be in situations where maybe a degree of centralization is acceptable or necessary for some use cases. And in other cases, we might be paring things down to absolute minimal local management by individuals or shared community within a very tight geographic space, as we see, most of my work was in fisheries, so I always tend to use fisheries examples. But, in Japan, all the prefectures that have local fisheries management organizations have been functioning for centuries. People know each other. The social norms are quite standardized. It's a fairly local resource. Maybe in a circular economy, a smaller circular economy in Bitcoin world, we see the same sort of things emerge over time.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, this is a new topic for me, but I do see some insights here that are very valuable. And it's sort of, as you say, the Austrian economics approach. I think there's obviously a lot that's valuable there, but also taking a long, hard look at reality and the way that firms and organizations and blocks emerge. Despite our best efforts to tell people to self-custody their Bitcoin, a lot of people still use Coinbase. And I see just the other day there was a big data breach, a data breach of Coinbase. And it's kind of like, well, when do people learn? And this is a really interesting place, because I don't know if we've had the opportunity to have something as decentralized as Bitcoin ever in the past. And so it's sort of this new function, and people are still trying to apply, this kind of logic of firms and markets to it. And then on the other side of that, there is an ideologically driven push to decentralize no matter what, even if it's not economical for you, because it isn't really that economic to do some of the stuff we do in Bitcoin, like, the cost associated with, the risk and the cost associated with running something like a Lightning channel, your own Lightning node, that can be a significant investment. And I guess the externality or the actual risk there is that you get rugged by using someone else's node, someone else's setup. But it's sort of putting all of that into the mix, and thinking from the perspective of the people out there in the world who maybe don't have the ideological leanings. What are they doing? We can see sort of trends, and the ETFs are a fascinating example of this, where in some cases, and the Bitcoin strategic reserves that these companies are developing, where actually it's at a premium. They're paying more to get this stuff than they would if they just brought Bitcoin. But there's something about it that leads to people doing that just because of the regulatory structures, the ease of access or whatever. And I just find that fascinating. And we do have to look at that reality, right, to make sense of things.
Well, it's interesting for strategy. It could keep a whole PhD program busy looking at the transaction costs economics, because those are entirely new products and companies that MicroStrategy is spinning off, and nobody in the financial world has seen stuff like this before. So I my bet, this sort of goes back to the big picture of what we talked about at the beginning, but sort of my vision, what I think is going to happen is that Bitcoin is going to get so big that there will be academic research programs focusing on Bitcoin. not just Bitcoin as one piece of a bigger program. I think what we'll see over time is that we'll see increasingly departments and universities finally clue in that Bitcoin is a really important new technology that has implications across all these spaces that we've just talked about, and that those need to be studied and researched. And yeah, I mean, the way that MicroStrategy and now 21 and all the corporate treasuries are going, like that could keep like a full economics or commerce department going steadily. Like I could see especially once you get into a larger university that has the sort of the critical mass in a particular field. I've only had that once in my career, actually. And I went to York in England, and my first day on the job, we were at a retreat where there was like 150 researchers in one hall. And our VP for research at the university was saying, well, I think we finally hit critical mass. And like I'm going, like, I thought 5 people was critical mass earlier on. But I could definitely see like large Bitcoin research consortiums or organizations start that really focus in on the finance aspects, the transaction cost economics aspects, the rules, and that's never mind the basic cryptography and everything that sort of goes along with Bitcoin itself. And then you look into the impacts, like how do you assess impacts? We've seen a lot of papers. I mean, Simon Collins and I have tried to get a paper out on adaptation. Haven't been successful yet. But there could be like an entire department of marketing, I'm sure, that could put PhDs to work on studies that looked at the actual, what are the determinants of Bitcoin adoption over time. So lots of potential out there. And I think we're going to see a real change over the next 5 years or so in the academic space as they realize that how far behind they are on Bitcoin knowledge and what's needed to really provide policy relevant information in the future.
Yeah. Well, something that I find very interesting is, in our sphere, and a lot of the people I talk with, my friends, we have this kind of this lens on Bitcoin that's very close to it. We run nodes, we know the jargon, we understand the core principles. But when I go a little bit further afield, Murray, and I meet people who own Bitcoin via an ETF, or they have sort of read a headline, and I'm like, man, there's billions of people out there like that, and there's I think a realization that the market, or the people are doing things, and there's outputs, and there's real world effect. The price is going up, number goes up, and we think we have a hold on what it is, but man, sometimes I don't know. I think it's just it's doing its thing, and it's important that we keep asking questions and coming back to some of these core assumptions. And this was an issue that you mentioned with the mining side, right? Like people have maybe the objectively wrong assumptions about what we're looking at when we talk about Bitcoin mining. And I also wonder, when it comes to talking about money, the economy, institutional economics, transaction cost economics, like what are the assumptions that we're talking about, and what is the way things are talked about? Because I feel like we're in a transition period at the moment where clearly something's happening, but still a lot of people refuse to see it, and it's a lot of opportunity in that moment, though, to for personal success, but also for society generally to look at this new thing with clear eyes, right?
Yeah, and the challenge, of course, is with the speed that technology is changing generally. How do we look at any new thing with, in a time frame and keep pace with it? It's just so difficult right now. And if you take the perspective of your some sort of finance advisor or strategic analyst for a company that isn't involved in Bitcoin, and you're trying to catch up on it right now, like, good luck with that. Like, I mean, people in the Bitcoin space can't keep up with it most of the time. And it's a fairly steep learning curve. And so I'm not sure, like, what the base knowledge is that people are going to, all those people that don't understand Bitcoin right now, how long is it going to take and what can be done to facilitate that transition? I'm not entirely sure about that.
Well, I also come back to some more fundamental questions around society and kind of the constitution of, the way nations and societies work, because, I mean, this can lean in towards a sort of sovereign individual mindset, but I do wonder whether there's going to be a great reckoning of the way society actually works at a high level, where maybe those who get it and those who don't get it end up in these kind of two strata, and the myth of nation state democracy and this kinds of stuff maybe starts to fade, and I already wonder whether we're in that mode where you've got these precariat gig workers and kind of the laptop class and these kinds of strata that seem actually quite archaic, but that is the reality that we've come into. And what does that mean? Is it folly to search for some great society-wide solution when actually you either get it or you have fun staying poor, as the meme goes, which is not necessarily a positive thing from a human perspective, but man, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to even think about sometimes. One thing that strikes me from both Austrian and institutional economics perspectives is that they're both focused on the bottom up. Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom were husband and wife pair at Indiana University, where I studied. I was there one year full time in my PhD, and they were very much. They looked back to the Tocqueville. His research in the United States very early on, and the importance of community meetings and sort of like town level round tables and forums for debating issues. And there's a whole movement on the, again, not necessarily politically left, but it tends to be picked up more that on that side, about deliberative democracy and the importance of deliberative democracy. And Vincent Ostrom in particular, Lynn was the micro person, he was the macro person in the pair. And he was like super adamant that democracy was something that evolved and was crafted, and you should view it as artisans keeping a democracy together, and that it was a lot of hard work. And one of the things with our society right now is that nobody seems to have any time to spare to do anything, and and I think probably Austrians and institutional economists, everybody in the space just about, would agree that, well, that's a function, that's a problem. Fix the money, fix the world, and that's part of it. And so we're in this age right now where nobody has time, nobody has the inclination to engage in learning about Bitcoin. Never mind deliberative democracy that requires engagement in all these different fields that are important in the places where they live. So Vincent was very big. The place where you live is where the problems reside, and the way that you solve that is through deliberation and contestation. He wasn't like about everybody living happily, ever after. He was he was an American federalist. He viewed the federal system and its it's as they call it in Indiana, polycentric governance, many different spheres of governance, always contesting each other, always experimenting. So, how do we get this governance experimentation going in a society that's too busy, that can't afford it, and that is pressed from a time horizon with other advancing technologies? And so it's a huge problem. Maybe the new technologies, maybe we'll be able to put AI on this problem and help us, free up some time eventually, but that's not clear right now either.
Yeah, well, just pulling on that thread, if it's okay, I mean, because again, This is quite fresh in my mind, because as I said, I've just been reading some stuff by Matthew Crawford, who's very interesting, talking about, again, he did a talk about these self-driving cars and just sort of how that's this top-down kind of nudge, effectively anti-human, which sees the humans as stupid, obsolete, fragile, hateful, unable to really drive a car. But actually, that's a very narrow lens that kind of equates a human being with a computer, and the computer's obviously going to win if you try and make them, in the same category. But actually taking the sort of social angle, that humans as a social creature, actually the reason why humans are actually pretty good drivers in a lot of cases is because they make eye contact and they're able to let someone, they can break a minor driving rule to let someone pass or whatever. And in sort of situations where a fully automatic system wouldn't be able to really deal with that kind of chaos of reality. Yeah. And it's interesting, this kind of democracy, this contention, which we kind of saw with Op Return, for better or for worse. I'm just kind of happy that people were having a go at each other because, I don't know. I mean, there was I have my own opinions on that whole thing, but it's like, well, at least people got up and had a go. And, a little bit tribalistic, maybe some misinformed opinions, but that for me is kind of positive. And the alternative, as you say, this kind of atomized society of not really engaging politically. I mean, that's actually quite dangerous because you automatically leave a vacuum there for the technocracy to come in and to sort of shape reality and kind of, especially when we look at these tech companies, and so in that sense, sorry, there's a lot of information, but I wonder if there's a kind of a mode here where Bitcoin, even though it is quite empowering, it also leads to kind of these communities and kind of engagements happening that maybe ripple out to society, which is for the most part kind of over politics. And especially in Japan where I live, it's post-political, man. Like no one cares. They live at the pleasure of the state, and it's sort of frozen, ossified, to use Bitcoin terminology. And I don't know, man. I don't know. It's like a kind of a neoliberal dark dream where there is no political. It's just these individual entities sort of doing their thing. I don't know how positive that is long term for social animals like humans.
No, it doesn't sound very positive. There's always going to be conflict, and we see social norms that conflict all the time, and how we end up resolving them is something that that takes work. I mean, there needs to be, you need to be able to monitor, which we can, like as humans, like you said, driving. I mean, we're very, very good at picking up social cues and driving social norms. I found that out, like personally driving in Thailand one time for I don't know, I had a rental vehicle for 4 months there. And, weekend, once I figured out what the horn honking meant, I was, as chaotic as any Thai driver. But at the same time, once you learn what the rules of the game are, then everything functions. And back to the institutional economics, Douglas North, another one of the Nobel Prize winners in institutional economics, he focused more on melding institutional economics and economic history, but he was the one that defined institutions. So institutions don't mean organizations. Institutions are the rules of the game. And the work that Lynn Ostrom did was, well, how do we differentiate, or how do we define the rules of the game? And there's this difference between the formal rules of government, which maybe Bitcoiners are dead set against. It's coercion or whatever the case is, whether it's financial sanctions or, physical imprisonment sanctions for different sorts of penalties. But then at the same time, we have social norms that are in place that are just as severe as that. Try being a lobster fisherman and drop your lobster pots up in New England and see what happens if you go into somebody else's territory. And I'm sure there's examples in Japan, like similar to that, where you don't cross borders, and that gets back to the transaction costs and the institutions. Things work if you have a community that is in a physical place and there are fairly clear boundaries and people have ways to monitor, and there's some sort of graduated sanctions. This all comes from Lynn Ostrom as well, that all these conditions that she found by studying water, like self-governing water systems and forestry and fisheries internationally, there's a certain set of conditions that tends to describe those places where self-governance can actually happen. But even there, self-governance, if you have a highly mobile fishery, for example, the local governance doesn't work. You need a strong governance that pays attention to local knowledge. Now, Bitcoin being completely global, both for mining and for use, I haven't even sort of thought out what the, implications for that are. But, it's a global international technology with no limits on who participates. That has some really important transaction cost economics implications as well that just like nobody's even begun to think about right now. I think as we go along, we're going to see a lot of surprises along the way.
Yeah. Well, just a couple more thoughts on that, Murray. Like, I've just the other day again, I was reading another essay on democracy and sort of this idea that there's these formal rules, but then there's the unspoken social rules that actually rely on something deep within the human psyche to make it work. And there was actually a really interesting essay by Brian Eno, who's a famous musician, who he came up with this new way of sort of writing music, which instead of using the classic score and the objective notation of music, it was more of like a description of how you do it in relation to other people. And if someone's singing at this note, try and sing one note higher, and da da da. And it was this kind of descriptive ways that basically rely on no formal training. And actually, interestingly, the music kind of comes out somewhat similar, no matter who does it, because people can follow these rules, even if they couldn't read the sheet music. And he sort of posits, sorry,
the vibe coding approach to music.
Yeah, I mean, vibe coding's got its AI connotations, but it's more like, well, look, if you put people in a room, generally speaking, you can expect certain outcomes.
Yeah.
Then it's not going to really do something super crazy, whereas an AI can actually hallucinate something super out there. And so it just sort of relies on something kind of the hardware of the human, the firmware of the human. And so democracy has a couple of rules that kind of lead that, but for the most part it's relying on something nascent in people. And I think that's quite an interesting approach. There's our little friend.
Sorry, somebody was like pestering me, so I had to bring him up for a bit.
What's his name, by the way?
This is Doug.
Doug. Hey, Doug. But anyway, man, look, it's all super interesting. So I'm keen to just wrap up with that then, Murray, and sort of look towards the future. You got this idea for transaction cost economics as a book. You got a few other things you're working on. I mean, what's the rest of 2025 sort of hold in store for you?
Get out the Horizon Scan project as quickly as possible, which I figure the draft will be about another month. I'm not sure how we'll put it out. Whether it will be like a sort of a Satoshi Action technical report, or if we'll actually go to try to put a published book out on it. It's very much aimed at academics and going through, and I've got like 100 information gaps in the research space, and some material on what type of research program could maybe address these gaps, and that's what it is. So it's very much oriented towards research funders and donors, academics, and not so much general readership. So we'll see about that. I've got. Yeah, I'll probably get back to the institutional piece after this. We've also been doing, we've also on the financial side, we had one journal article that was published on, I did a price model for Bitcoin that was based on fixed supply and demand, so a very microeconomic approach to putting values or projecting price trajectories for the future for Bitcoin. And then we also did some reports on state pension funds, some counterfactuals on what would have happened if state pensions, and this feeds into the Satoshi Action Fund work that Eric Peterson and Dennis Porter are doing. So we have probably a bit more of that. I have some modifications to the model, to the financial model that I need to get done. Just a couple of tweaks to account for Bitcoin coming back into the system. The initial model, I assumed that every Bitcoin that went to an ETF would stay there, which obviously that's not the case. And it slows down that would slow down the supply shock sometime, some period into the future. But what I'm interested in on the economic modeling is when is the supply shock likely, and how much of a supply shock is that likely to be? And I think we're, I'd say I'm sort of like 75% of the way there with the first paper. But again, like the methane modeling that I've done, I know I should be doing this in Python instead. and make it, allowing it, putting it out open source model so people could just tweak away and see what their own assumptions are. And so far I haven't had time to like sit down with the AI and sort of work out what it would take to translate models from this analytical code into Python.
Yeah, understood that. You got a little bit on your plate there, then. It sounds all really exciting. And I guess, I feel like we kind of dived in pretty deep with the transaction cost economics. But one final question for you. I mean, what do you think is the most important question we need to be thinking about right now with Bitcoin?
The most important question. Oh man, that's a nasty one. Personally, I think it's as we look to potential large-scale adoption worldwide, I'm really interested myself, what are the determinants of adoption? So what do people have to know? What sort of culture? What makes people adopt Bitcoin, and will it be sticky over time? And that sort of has a technical backdrop. I mean, there needs to be some improvements, maybe in Lightning, or maybe it'll be Liquid or another side chain that becomes really important. I mean, that's one of them. I also think that it's really important that we start to think about the sort of what the future will look like under different, under different Bitcoin trajectories that vary along key axes. So we can think institutional versus personal adoption, contestation with governance versus governance, or governments being on board. There's a lot of different sort of axes we can cleave things apart on. And a lot of those futures don't look particularly bright if you start to think out what really is involved with them. I mean, we get into these futures where you might have sort of like a small scale Bitcoin systems operating regionally, but they don't integrate globally. There's all sorts of questions about what would be the preferred outcome for Bitcoin on a global scale, and how do we shape the pathway there? Because there's many different divergent pathways that could go in different directions.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think it's important to be asking these kinds of questions, Murray. And your work, research, doing academic study into this is very important. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me again today, and I hope we can keep in touch.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks very much for having me.